Okay, so I'm going to be looking at why there are these disjunctive particles in Sinhala Dravidian relative-correlatives. So these existential particles in these non-existential environments. So we'll start off by talking about these different types of Q particles and their distribution. Then look at the fact that these particles from the series that we don't expect end up showing up in these the Sinhala Dravidian relative clauses. Do a little look a bit at these ever-type relatives cross-linguistically, and then look at how we might analyze these two different types. And then speculate a little bit on the historical evolution of these. So in a number of languages, the existence of these quantifier particles is more obvious than in others, languages like Japanese and Sinhala Dravidian. We very obviously see these particles, these quantifier particles from these two different series playing a wide variety of roles. So the one type, which we call the mu type from Japanese mo, this is the one that appears in universal conjunctive environments, and then its counterpart, this kappa type, Japanese ka, appears in existential and disjunctive and interrogative context. So for instance, we can see from a number of languages here, examples from the mu series and the ka series here. And so examples of environments in which these occur. So in a number of languages, you combine one of these mu elements with an interrogative pronoun, and you get a universal type like everyone or anyone, everything, and so on. Added in the structure X mo, B mo, you get both A and B, and added to a single element, you get something like an additive A2, or a scalar additive even A. And then for the kappa type, these, when added to an interrogative pronoun, you get this existential interpretation, something, someone. They also show up in a number of languages in the formation of questions, potentially both WH questions and yes-no questions, as well as alternative questions, and in the formation of disjunctions, including non-interrogative disjunctions. So in terms of looking at classical Sinhala, which is going to be the main form of Sinhala that I'll look at, because by the modern colloquial language, these relative correlatives don't exist anymore. We only find them in earlier stages. We do find them, however, in modern literary Sinhala, which is an archaic variety. So in classical Sinhala, which is essentially from around the 12th to 15th centuries, we find this element da, which is one of these kappa particles. Usually in yes-no questions have this, frequently, but not always, in WH questions. We seem to always get it in alternative questions. And in non-question context, where we get these disjunctions, which are not interrogative, instead of da, we get this other alternative kappa particle ho. Okay, so then if we're looking exactly at relative correlatives in classical and modern literary Sinhala, these are interesting that they always involve this, what we might call a clause closing, or what has been called a clause closing particle. So that at the end of the relative clause, you'll have this particle. This is also true in certain Dravidian languages, that namely in South and South Central Dravidian languages. And so we can see two examples of these: one from classical Sinhala, one from Malayalam. Okay. And so we have the relative clause here, and then we've got this da element at the end of the relative clause, and then we have the correlative clause. The same thing in Malayalam, so we've got the relative clause, then this ol element, and the correlative clause. The interesting thing is that both of these, the Sinhala da, the Malayalam o, these are both these kappa type particles, these existential type particles, and that's not immediately what we'd expect here, given that there's a couple of different interpretations, and these two examples actually, or the most likely interpretations of these, sort of illustrate these two. So the classical Sinhala one is one of these identity epistemic ones, where, so whoever I see first, I shall kill him. This is, like, I don't know or I don't care about the identity of the person, but there is some particular individual, and that's the individual that in question. It's just ignorance or indifference to the exact identity. Whereas the Malayalam one, whoever controls his mind, he obtains peace. This is this free choice type interpretation, where it's essentially paraphrasable as everybody who controls his mind obtains peace. Okay. So in both of those contexts, it seems like we want something like a universal. We need to quantify over a bunch of different things. So it's, whoever I see first, like, it doesn't matter who it is, whether it's this person or this person or this person. All of those people are potential candidates. And this one, even more obviously, it means sort of for all of those people. And in fact, when we contrast it with other Indo Aryan languages which have relative correlatives, like Hindi and Nepali. Now, in Hindi and Nepali, you don't have to have one of these particles, but you can have a particle. So you have things like in Hindi, jab bhi dili jata hu. Okay, so we have this jab bhi. Okay. And in Nepali, jai suke, usko gar gai, pani, etc. But notably, these particles are the mu particles, the ones that occur in conjunctive and universal environments. Sort of interestingly said that the Hindi one is sort of like English, it's contiguous, so you've got the relative pronoun, and then you've got this additive particle. The Nepali actually structurally looks like the Dravidian and Sinhala, namely you've got your relative here and your particle sits at the end of the relative clause, which is interesting. And cross-linguistically, okay, so not looking specifically at relative relatives, but relatives that involve this sort of ever interpretation. The way that these seem to turn out, the most prevalent type that I could find examples of are of the English Hindi sort of type. We've got a WH word, or relative pronoun, plus some mu element, something like ever, or also, or even. There are some other ones that again involve WH things, plus a modal marker, as in Greek, Spanish, and Catalan. And there are a number of other strategies. So modern Hebrew does a WH word plus some sort of negation element. Turkish is interesting because structurally, again, it looks a bit like what we see in Sinhala and Dravidian. So you have a WH word plus a conditional marker on the verb, which effectively means this marker is going to sit at the end of that relative clause again. In Korean, so this isn't about relative correlatives, but we do have this case where we get one of these disjunctive kappa type elements in this environment where it seems to get a universal interpretation. But this has been suggested to be something about that there's a required distributive operator, and that's the one that's actually doing the work. In any case, it doesn't end up being directly helpful because it's not a relative type element. Hungarian is at least seemingly a bit different for these, where you get this chuck, which is this only element attached to force this ever reading. Though the other possibility is that chuck is a bit polysemous, so maybe it's not the only reading that's being picked out. Okay. But to return to the Sinhala Dravidian type, so again, the thing is that we've got this particle which doesn't seem to immediately do the sort of work that we want it to do. We've got this particle of this kappa type. And the languages in which these appear, they're actually geographically contiguous. So Sinhala's here, and it's these southern Dravidian languages and south central Dravidian languages that are the ones that actually have this. So it does seem to be something that looks Aryan. Yeah, here's a number of examples. In Dravidian, and again, we just see that we've got some sort of relative clause plus this kappa particle at the end of each of those from a number of different south and south central Dravidian languages. Okay, so to look at what people have said about what's been said about this mu type, so the Hindi English type. So Dial has in the 90s had a couple of different analyses of these. The latter of which invokes this notion of adding this p, this additive scalar particle, adds this modal dimension, which introduces these I alternatives, these identity alternatives. And I'm not going to go too much in the details of her analysis, but she derives both this identity reading and the free choice reading, partially through intersection with aspect in both Hindi and English. But crucially, what's involved in both of those, you have some sort of universal quantification over these I alternatives. So there is universal quantification involved. And this isn't surprising if we've got one of these additive elements that's associated with universal quantification. And here's just Hindi examples that show the interaction with aspect in picking out one of these two things. Okay, so then the real question is then how do we deal with these kappa type relative relatives? So I'm going to suggest there's an epistemic component involved in this, which does part of the work. Okay? And so the background for this is, in a bit later Sinhala, we do see these things obviously showing up with epistemic components. So in modern literary Sinhala, for instance, this whole element which occurs, which can form these disjunctions, also when combined with the WH word forms an indefinite, but it forms an epistemic indefinite that signals I don't know or I don't care about the antecedent of something. Now, it's not until the modern colloquial Sinhala that da actually gains this ability, but then da, by modern colloquial Sinhala, also joins with WH words to form these epistemic indefinites. And the two types of epistemic indefinites are actually not pragmatically exactly equivalent, though figuring out exactly how to describe the difference between them is a bit tricky, and is not actually what I'm going to be concerned with here today. But what my idea is to take this epistemic component is involved then in these relative correlatives. And so I want to sort of repurpose what Alonso Valle and Menendez Benito did, discussing epistemic indefinites, that they said that they carry this anti-singleton presupposition, which then can get cashed out in various different ways. And combine this with a choice function analysis of the Q particles. Okay, so these Q particles, these kappa particles, will denote variables over choice functions, but they'll carry this additional anti-singleton presupposition. And then this will end up interacting with, well, the relative pronoun, which I assume will involve some sort of maximality operator, which essentially says, okay, so it's going to pick out, from a set, it's going to pick out the individual which makes the relevant proposition true, and also requiring that any individual which makes this true has to be either identical to this first individual or a part of it. Okay. So that is, this would be satisfied in two different situations, either where the relative pronoun is essentially plural and denotes a sum, and crucially includes a least upper bound, and that would be the one that can be picked out, and then everything else which will make this true will be part of that. Or trivially, where you actually have a singleton set, and then it will be trivially satisfied. So then we've got da, which will denote this variable of choice functions. It'll bear this anti-singleton constraint. But I'll suggest that this anti-singleton constraint is not exactly just about the cardinality of the set. Rather, it's a bit more specific than that. So it's looking at something like the set of extensions in the worlds consistent with the speaker's beliefs about the members of P, that those have to be greater than 1. So it could be that there's a singleton set that contains an individual concept, but it happens that in the worlds that are consistent with the speaker's beliefs, there's going to be multiple ways of extending that. So it's not going to be just one potential extensional individual. I'm going to assume that the max ends up applying first. That seems to be structurally what would happen, considering that this Q particle is sort of sitting on the edge on the outside. So we really need to satisfy two things, the anti-singleton presupposition, and then max also needs to be satisfied. Okay. So the anti-singleton presupposition requires that there somehow be multiple things in one way or the other. Max requires that either be a maximal sum or else a single atom. So one way to satisfy both of these is assuming that there is a maximal sum, so this is if we have the sort of plural interpretation, and assuming that the anti-singleton presupposition doesn't treat a maximal sum as a singleton, that it's saying, okay, so this actually is composed of multiple things. Right? And this will give us the universal reading. The other one would be the identity reading. In this one, we would have a single individual, and so max is going to be trivially satisfied. It's just going to hand that one off to the Q particle. But the only case in which the Q particle's presupposition will then be satisfied is if this is actually an individual concept that's going to extend in at least two different ways, according to the speaker's knowledge. Okay. And this would give us the identity reading, right, where this epistemic identity reading. And some reduced derivations here, looking at these. So for this free choice reading, this, go out of the kingdom, taking all of those who obey you, where we have things actually marked as plural here. Or the identity one, this is whichever person I see first, I shall kill them, and so on. Okay, which would be the identity reading. Okay, there are some ones that are a little bit tricky, so that we get some of these Dravidian readings where It doesn't seem like it's about speaker ignorance. So things like the boy who you shook hands with is my friend, that one doesn't suggest itself to be speaker ignorance. But as has been suggested about these, I think the ignorance can be projected to the addressee rather than only the speaker. The speaker is just the sort of default. And things like the book which give you such troubles is right here. That's something like an indifference reading about the identity. A number of examples of plurals. There's some other interesting things which happen with classical singular. You can get multiple relative pronouns correlated with multiple correlative pronouns, so that works fine. The other thing I didn't mention before is that the other alternative to having da on these is to have none, which is this conditional particle that you use to form conditionals otherwise. There are some weird cases in classical singular where you have multiple clauses in the relative, and if you have that, then you don't seem to need any particle, and I'm not sure why that is, other than to say that all of these examples from classical singular I have are all the cases where they appear as their exact translations of Pali relative-correlatives. And so maybe for this one, they just lost track of something at some point in time. Okay, but so turning to what happens even earlier in Old Singular. So in Old Singular, these are really, really rare, these relative-correlatives. I mean, we might have expected, okay, they should be more common at this point in time. But they look, relative-correlatives in Singular look like they're already archaic by the Old Singular period. And the ones that appear in classical singular do seem to be influenced by their translations from texts that have these constructions. There's only one example in Old Singular that I found that's actually a relative-correlative that has some sort of clause-closing particle. All the other ones just look sort of more like Sanskrit or Pali relative-correlatives. They don't have any particle. And it's not the da, so it's not the kappa particle, it's this conditional. And it doesn't, in fact, sit quite on the edge anyway. All of the other ones, all the other ones use this relative-correlative, but they don't have any of these particles involved in them. And so one thing to think is, well, maybe this is then influence from Dravidian, right? Because Dravidian does have these things, and that's probably a reasonable thing to think. But when we look at early Dravidian, we also don't find this occurring always. I mean, we find plenty of examples from Old Dravidian where we don't get any particle, so we just have a relative structure. One of the early examples which I have where we do get one of these particles, these kappa particles, you notice it doesn't actually sit at the end of the clause. It in fact sits on a word because in Dravidian there's not a separate relative series, so they're identical to interrogative pronouns. So the other possibility is that this isn't really a relative-correlative, that this really, instead of whichever, this actually just means some, right? So rather than on whichever day you will go, this is on some day you would go, and then just referring back to that. The other thing is, except for the southern and south central Dravidian languages, the other ones, we don't have any evidence of any of these particles ever showing up in relative-correlatives in the other languages. So to go back to this, so it's only essentially in these languages down here that we find them. So it's not clear that it's something that we could reconstruct, for instance, for Proto-Dravidian or anything like that. So it almost looks like it's a southern, it almost looks like it's a geographic innovation in southern and southern central Dravidian and in Singular. So maybe it's some sort of convergent development. The question is, it's sort of weird to have, I mean, so once you have these relative-correlatives in Singular and Dravidian, they always seem to have this variation. It's either identity or it's free choice. And that's, in a sense, weird because you don't always get that with relative-correlatives. One thing is that these languages do have another way of forming these, forming things that like relative clauses. There are these prenominal modifying participial constructions, and they don't have any sort of identity reading or free choice reading. And this is true both in Sinhala and Dravidian. And we find something rather similar in Nepali, where in spoken Nepali doesn't usually like to do relative-correlatives. It usually does this prenominal modifying participial type. And where you do get these real relative-correlatives in Nepali, it's either in formal writing or in these cases where even if you don't put pani in, you tend to get some sort of ever-type reading. Okay. Though this isn't true in Hindi. We also have the issue of just the fact that in some languages these things can be underspecified. So Hungarian's like this, English is like this as well. That you can, even without ever, you can get these sort of ever readings. Okay, so we've then coming back to the thinking about relative correlatives. We have this mu type which has this element in it that we'd expect to give us these universal readings. And this kappa type, we seem to be able to get the same sort of effect out of combining this anti-singleton presupposition, this epistemic component that the kappa particles seem to have, interacting with the maximality requirement that the relative pronoun has. And this can then be cashed out depending on various factors in one of these two different readings, the ignorance indifference or the free choice. Of course, it would be nice for the other type, this mu type, to have a more fully compositional account, so it's sort of obvious that universality is involved, but it'd be nice to figure out exactly how that gets in. There are other things that still interest me in terms of the structural things. So Hindi and Nepali sort of look the same in that they use the same particle, but the structure is very different, and so I'm not certain what the consequences are of the WH word and the particle being contiguous or the particle being this clause closing thing that sits at the end. So Nepali looks structurally like Sinhala, but it has the same particle that Hindi, the same type of particle that Hindi has. And then to sort of further investigate the exact distribution of labor in terms of which of these types of constructions, the sort of true relative correlative or the prenominal type, is used and what sorts of meanings can be derived from these. All right. Yes.
Clarification question. So one of your first examples had something like whoever I see first, or but that cannot be an anti-singleton. They cannot, you know. So whoever I see first cannot mean everyone whom I see first, because I cannot see more than one person.
So you can't.
I want to understand how the anti-singleton.
You can't get that free choice reading out of it. But yeah. I'm assuming it's still going to be anti-singleton in the sense that you couldn't say that if you know who you're going to see first, right? Or if you don't, or maybe you don't care who you see first or whatever. That's when you could use that.
Yeah. So some of these. So let me just try to understand. So I think in Hungarian, when you add the chalk, that it's always a universal in the sense that I could not combine.
You can't get the identity
first, right?
Okay.
So it would because it would mean that everyone whom I see first, I will kill, but I cannot see more than one person.
But what about, could you put it in like the second example? Could you, what would you do for something like this? Because this one could be.
It could have if they are temporally different, distinct, right? So now this person controls his mind and obtains peace. Then another person controls his mind and then this other person. But I mean simultaneously again.
Oh, it could have like
the predicate excludes.
Okay, it couldn't have like a generalizing reading where you're just meaning you don't really care about the particular time. You're just saying this is like the gnomic reading where you're just saying like this is an internal truth sort of.
But all I'm trying to say that is either there's a scope relation. I mean both seeing first. It has to be a single individual.
Yes.
And controlling the mind, probably multiple controllers cannot simultaneously
control the same
mind.
Yes.
So these all require some, I mean, it's not just like whoever likes it should stand up, right?
Yeah, because it's still
multiple people can like.
Yeah. I mean, because these still are true relative correlatives, you have to have that correlative pronoun there. Yeah. So yeah, they are restricted. They are indeed restricted.
I mean, one goofy idea is to treat that really as a question particle. To say that the relative is in fact an embedded question. So, and that way you get the uniqueness coming from the question meaning.
So that you're saying
that's again that's anti-similar.
So you're treating it like it's a yes no question, or treating it like it's a WH question.
Yeah, because for instance the da, right, that's the Q particle.
Yeah.
In Slovenian, or Slavonic generally, the free choice marker is koli, which contains a li. That's a free choice marker, right? Which is again sort of counterintuitive, because you'd expect in these contexts to get the universal, not the existential.
Right.
So I'm not sure.
And so you'd get something like universal out because you're just going to take the whole question reading and sort of pass that on, and because that's...
Yeah, maybe the new is silent, maybe there's more than that. Just like, take what you want as opposed to take whatever you want. I'm not sure.
I mean, it's interesting.
Very puzzling.
Because you can also get, as I showed, you can also get that conditional particle, which, I mean, in a sort of very general way makes sense because we understand there's a relationship between conditionals and these sort of relative correlatives. But how exactly that's, specifically that's working, is still something that would be nice to understand.
Thanks again.
Mm-hmm.
That's caffeine.